Hey everyone, here today to talk about imperialism. We're going to focus on the causes and motivations of it. So let's go ahead and get started with just real simply, what is the definition of imperialism? So imperialism is really quite simple to understand. It is the economic or political domination of strong nations over weaker nations. So whenever a country kind of politically or economically controls a weaker nation, that is typically known as imperialism. Imperialism was kind of in its heyday in the late 19th, early 20th century, 20 centuries. If you look at the map below, you can see all of the areas of the world that are controlled by mainly European nations, but also, the Americans also controlled some things as well. So, for instance, if you look at the British, for instance, any country that's kind of like that brownish, orangish color, were colonies or territories of the British. So, Canada, India, Australia, Egypt, South Africa, parts of China, even a couple small parts of South America there. Those were all areas that were controlled by the British, okay, either politically or economically. Okay, so I guess the first question is why, if we go back to that map, why did the Europeans, I mean, if you look at Africa, Africa is completely dominated in, the Southwest Pacific and, Southeast Asia. I mean, those are all parts of the world that are just very heavily colonized or imperialized. What allowed for the Europeans to really to do this to the rest of the world? All right, there's really two main factors. Number one, the Europeans were really the first to industrialize, which gave them a huge advantage. They had the ability to mass produce weapons like machine guns, cannons, and stuff like that. And they were going up against people that had bows and arrows or just very primitive weapons. So it was a huge advantage for the Europeans. Okay. Also, unfortunately for like places like India and China, which historically have been very impressive civilizations, they were at probably their weakest points. When the Europeans were getting stronger. So it was kind of just bad luck for the Indians and the Chinese and much of Africa, is that they were at a very weak point in their history when the Europeans were at a very strong point in theirs. All right. So I guess the question is, why did the Europeans want to be so imperialistic? Why did they want to control other nations? And there's basically three reasons we're going to look at. All right. The first one is economic interest. Basically, because of industrialization, the European nations needed a lot of raw materials. Okay. So one of the things they would do is they would go ahead, take over an area, and basically get the raw materials from that place. Okay, so for instance, the United States, we were a colony before we were a country. We were a colony of Great Britain, and so one of the things that we did is that we grew a lot of cotton, cut down a lot of lumber. We would send that stuff back to Great Britain. Great Britain would use that cotton, use that lumber to make very nice clothes, very nice furniture, ships, whatever, blah blah blah. All right, so if you were a European nation, you'd want to have colonies to suck their raw materials out, their resources out, and then you'd also want them to buy your stuff. So it'd be a new place for you kind of to sell your goods. All right. Moving on. Another reason for imperialism, political motives. Basically, if you had colonies, that basically meant that you were a strong nation. So if you had the ability to take over weaker nations, that was kind of like a feather in your cap. It made you look strong. And so when countries like Italy and Germany finally became officially nations, these guys very much so wanted to prove that they belonged with the big dogs. And so these guys tried to gobble up colonies and grab some territory. All right. So anyways, if you look at this little political cartoon over here, it shows all the nations of Europe kind of pulling at Africa. It's a very famous title, The Mad Scramble for Africa. Very few African nations were able to not be taken over by the Europeans. Okay. And the reason for this car here is if you have a ride that's kind of pimped out, it kind of shows that you're wealthy. It kind of shows that you're a big deal. So colonies were kind of the same thing for countries back then. It showed that you had a lot of power. Okay. The other major reason for imperialism is social Darwinism. I'm sure we've all heard of Darwinism. He came up with the theory of survival of the fittest, the theory of evolution, blah blah blah. And basically they took this theory that the strong survive in nature, to kind of fit with governments. The strong people will rule over the weaker nations, will take out the weaker nations, and that's just the way of things. And so basically, this is kind of like scientific racism. Um, but basically, the Europeans looked at the Asians, they looked at the Africans, and they basically saw them as being inferior. They had not industrialized, they did not have as much technology as the Europeans. And so, because of this, the Europeans simply reasoned that the reason the Europeans had more stuff is because they were superior. And that was kind of like what allowed them to have the right to take over these weaker nations. In fact, some Europeans even rationalized to themselves that it was the white man's burden to basically take over the world and teach people how to be civilized. And so a lot of Europeans and even Americans back in the day believed that they were doing their duty to humanity by taking over these inferior races and teaching them how to be civilized people. Okay, which obviously today sounds incredibly racist. All right. Um, so, anyways, here's a couple political cartoons that kind of show. Here's one that's entitled "The White Man's Burden." So, if you look at the white man's burden here, you can see, this dude is clearly from India, and he's carrying this big fat British dude. Here you see Uncle Sam. You know, he's being carried by, someone else. Here's a Kaiser. He's a German dude. He's being carried by somebody, and there's also somebody back here, but it's kind of hard to see who that is. It could be a Spanish dude or something like that. But anyways, it kind of shows all those guys being carried by their, colonial, I guess, servants, I guess. And here's another one, incredibly racist, another one entitled "The White Man's Burden." And it's an American, so you can see it's an American by, right there is Cantina. There says an American. You can see a couple American flags, a ship, and then here you see a school. All right, it's a schoolhouse on it, and you can see that the American is carrying this native, who obviously does not. They don't portray this person to look like a person. It looks very much. It's very racist. It makes him look more like an animal. But you can see that he's this American is kind of struggling up this mighty hill, carrying this native who looks like he's struggling to the schoolhouse to show him how to become a civilized person. So, the message is very clear in this cartoon. So anyways, those are some of the basics about imperialism, why it happened. So just to kind of review, if we go back, here are the biggest reasons for imperialism. So anyways, hope that helped. See you later.